Perfect Timing Part 1. Danny Cole never wanted to be a hero. He never wanted to be a soldier or a fighter or anything special at all. He was just a cargo hauler working on Station Omega 7 in the belt. He moved boxes from one place to another. He played cards with his friends on Friday nights. He owed money to a guy named Rick who ran a gambling den on the lower decks. That was his life. Simple and boring and completely ordinary. Then the came. Danny remembered the day with perfect clarity even though he wished he could forget it. He was in the loading bay moving a shipment of medical supplies when the first explosion hit. The whole station shook like someone had grabbed it and tried to tear it apart. Danny fell to the ground and watched as the ceiling panels crashed down around him. Alarms screamed through the corridors. Red emergency lights flickered on and off. He got up and ran toward the observation window. What he saw made his blood turn cold. Ships, dozens of them. Warships surrounded the station like wolves circling a wounded animal. They were beautiful in a terrible way, sleek and silver with sharp angles that seemed designed to cut through space itself. Danny had heard stories about them his whole life. Everyone had. They were the hunters of the galaxy. They had conquered 40 worlds and viewed every other species as either slaves or prey. Humans were prey. The boarding began within minutes. Danny watched through security feeds as soldiers poured into the station. They were tall creatures with silver-scaled skin and 4 amber eyes that glowed in the dark. They moved like predators, fast and silent and deadly. They did not come to negotiate or demand surrender. They came to hunt. Danny watched his friends die. He watched Ben from accounting get dragged away in chains. He watched Lisa from engineering fight back with a wrench before a blade opened her throat. He watched old Pete from maintenance throw himself at 3 soldiers to buy time for a group of children to escape. Pete died screaming, but the children got away. Danny hoped they made it to the escape pods. He never found out. He should have run. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, but his legs would not move. He stood there in the loading bay surrounded by scattered medical supplies and watched the horror unfold on the screens around him. That was when she found him. The door to the loading bay slid open and a figure stepped through. She was different from the other, taller, more elegant. She wore armor that was black instead of silver and carried a blade that curved like a crescent moon. Her 4 eyes scanned the room until they found Danny standing there like a fool. She smiled. It was not a nice smile. She walked toward him slowly, not because she was being cautious, because she was savoring the moment. Danny could see it in the way she moved, the way her eyes never left his face. She was a predator who had found her prey and she wanted to enjoy every second of it. Danny finally found his voice. It came out as a whisper. "Please." They stopped a few feet away from him. She tilted her head and studied him like he was an interesting insect she had found crawling on the ground. "You are afraid," she said. Her voice was strange, musical but cold, like wind chimes made of ice. "Good, fear makes the hunt." Danny did not understand. "Hunt? What hunt?" She laughed. It was a terrible sound. "I am Eth, trophy hunter of the Third Circle. I have hunted prey across 9 systems. I have claimed 112 trophies from 47 of your kind." She leaned closer and Danny could smell her breath. It smelled like copper and something else he could not identify. "You will be my greatest hunt." Danny's mind struggled to process what she was saying. "I do not understand. You are going to kill me." Eth shook her head slowly. "Not now, not here. That would be boring, unsatisfying." She reached out and touched his face with one clawed finger. The claw was sharp enough to draw a thin line of blood across his cheek. "I am giving you a gift. 1 cycle. 1 full rotation of your calendar. Run, hide, prepare yourself, and then I will come for you." She stepped back and spread her arms wide. "The entire galaxy will be our hunting ground. You may go anywhere, do anything, seek any help you wish. It will not matter. I have never failed to claim a target. You will be trophy number 113. Danny stared at her. His mind was blank. His body was numb. This could not be happening. This had to be a nightmare. Eth turned and walked toward the door. She paused at the threshold and looked back over her shoulder. "Run well, Danny Cole. Make this hunt worthy of my time." Then she was gone. Danny stood alone in the loading bay. Around him the station was dying. He could hear screams and explosions and the sound of soldiers celebrating their victory. He knew he should feel something. Fear, anger, despair. But he felt nothing. He was empty inside. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking. 1 year. She had given him 1 year to live. He did not know how long he stood there. Minutes, maybe hours. Eventually his survival instincts kicked in and he started moving. He found his way to the emergency hangar where his ship was docked. The drifter was a piece of junk. A 30-year-old cargo hauler with a failing engine and a navigation system that only worked half the time. But it was his. He climbed aboard and started the launch sequence. Through the viewport he could see the ship still circling the station. They did not try to stop him. They let him go, because Eth had marked him and her prey was not to be touched by anyone else. Danny flew away from Station Omega 7 and did not look back. He had 1 year to prepare, 1 year to learn how to survive, 1 year before the greatest hunter in the Dominion came to claim his head as a trophy. Danny Cole had never been special. He had never been brave or strong or clever. He was just a cargo hauler with a gambling debt and a broken ship. But as he flew into the endless darkness of space, with nothing but fear and determination keeping him alive, he made a promise to himself. Eth thought she was hunting prey. She thought Danny was just another weak human waiting to die. She was wrong. Danny was going to survive, not just for 1 year. He was going to survive long enough to make her regret ever pointing at him across that burning loading bay. He did not know how. He did not know if it was even possible, but he was going to try. Because the alternative was dying, as trophy number 113. And Danny Cole refused to be anyone's trophy. Danny spent the first 3 months running. He jumped from system to system with no plan and no destination. He slept in his ship. He ate whatever cheap food he could afford. He kept moving because standing still felt like dying. The drifter took him to places he had only heard about in stories. Frontier colonies where the law did not reach. Trading posts built inside hollowed-out asteroids. Space stations run by criminals and refugees and people who had nowhere else to go. Danny moved through these places like a ghost. He spoke to no one. He trusted no one. He just kept running. But running was not a plan. Running was just delaying the inevitable. He found Pete Carson on a moon called in the Outer Territories. The moon was a wasteland of red sand and abandoned mines. The only settlement was a collection of metal buildings that looked like they might collapse at any moment. Pete ran a small repair shop there. He fixed ships and equipment for anyone who could pay. Danny had heard about Pete from a smuggler he met at a trading post. The smuggler said Pete was the only human who had ever escaped a trophy hunter. Danny did not know if it was true, but he had to find out. Pete was 73 years old with gray hair and a cybernetic leg that made a clicking sound when he walked. His hands shook when he held things. His eyes were tired and sad, like he had seen too much pain in his life. But when Danny told him about Eth, those tired eyes suddenly became sharp and focused. "Trophy hunter of the third circle," Pete said slowly. He was sitting behind the counter of his shop surrounded by broken parts and tools. "That is bad luck. Those are the elite hunters, the best of the best." Danny nodded. "She gave me 1 year. That was 3 months ago." 9 months left. Pete leaned back in his chair. "Not much time." "I know. That is why I came to you. The smuggler said you escaped a trophy hunter once." Pete was quiet for a long moment. His hands trembled as he reached for a cup of something that smelled terrible. He took a long drink before answering. "I did not escape. I survived. There is a difference." He set down the cup. The hunter who marked me was young, arrogant, he made mistakes. I got lucky, very lucky. His eyes met Danny's. Luck will not save you from a third circle hunter. Danny felt his hope starting to fade. Then what will? Pete studied him carefully. He looked at Danny's soft hands and his weak arms and his body that had never known real hardship. He looked at him like he was measuring something important. "Why do you want to survive?" Pete asked. Danny blinked. "What do you mean? Everyone wants to survive." "No, not everyone. Some people give up. Some people decide that fighting is too hard and death is easier." Pete leaned forward. "If you want me to help you, then I need to know that you will not give up. I need to know that you will do whatever it takes, even when it hurts, even when it seems impossible, even when every part of your body is screaming at you to quit." Danny thought about the question. He thought about Station Omega-7 and all the people who died there. He thought about Eth pointing at him across the loading bay. He thought about being trophy number 113. "I want to survive because she thinks I cannot," Danny said finally. "She looked at me and saw prey. She saw something weak and helpless and easy to kill. I want to prove her wrong. I want to show her that humans are not just trophies waiting to be collected." Pete smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. "Good answer." Pete became Danny's teacher. For the next 5 years, he taught Danny everything he knew about survival and combat, and the training was brutal. Danny woke up before sunrise every day and ran until his legs gave out. He lifted weights until his muscles screamed. He practiced fighting with knives and guns and his bare hands until his knuckles bled and his body was covered in bruises. Pete did not go easy on him. He pushed Danny harder than Danny had ever been pushed in his life. When Danny wanted to quit, Pete reminded him what was waiting for him if he failed. When Danny felt sorry for himself, Pete told him stories about the people that had hunted and killed. "Pain is temporary," Pete said one day after a particularly brutal training session. Danny was lying on the ground gasping for breath. Every part of his body hurt. "Death is permanent, remember that." But the physical training was only part of it. Pete also taught Danny how to think like a hunter. "They are not smarter than us," Pete explained. "They are more patient. They think in decades. A trophy hunter will spend years studying a target, learning their habits, finding their weaknesses. You need to do the same thing. You need to study Eth the same way she is studying you." Danny spent hours researching Eth and He learned their biology and their culture and their religion. He learned that trophy hunters followed a strict code of honor. They hunted alone unless their prey proved exceptionally dangerous. They always gave their targets a chance to run. They believed that a difficult hunt brought them closer to their gods. He learned that Eth had been hunting for over a century. She had never failed to claim a target. She was considered one of the greatest hunters of her generation. He also learned her weaknesses. She was arrogant. She underestimated her prey because no prey had ever truly challenged her. She followed patterns in her hunting style because those patterns had always worked before. Eth found Danny twice during those first 5 years. Both times she nearly killed him. The first time she caught him on a space station and chased him through the corridors. Danny escaped by jumping into an airlock and blowing himself into space. He almost died from decompression before Pete could rescue him. The second time she ambushed him on a frontier world. They fought hand to hand and she carved a scar across his face with her claws. Danny survived only because he triggered an avalanche that buried them both. He dug himself out. She dug herself out, but by the time she recovered, he was already gone. Each encounter taught Danny something new. He learned how she moved, how she thought, how she tracked her prey. Every scar on his body was a lesson paid for in blood. By the end of the 5th year, Danny was not the same person who had fled Station Omega-7. His body was hard and strong. His mind was sharp and focused. His eyes had the look of someone who had seen violence and was no longer afraid of it. Pete looked at him one evening as they sat outside the repair shop, watching the sun set over the red sand. "You are ready," Pete said quietly. Danny shook his head. "Ready for what? To fight her. I cannot beat her in a straight fight. She is faster and stronger and more experienced." Pete smiled that small smile again. "Ready to stop running, ready to start hunting." Danny thought about that. He thought about the 5 years of pain and training and near-death experiences. He thought about how far he had come from the scared cargo hauler who could not even move when Eth pointed at him. Pete was right. He was done running. It was time to become the hunter instead of the hunted. Danny was not the only human who had been marked by a trophy hunter. There were others scattered across the galaxy, survivors who had escaped death and were now living in hiding, waiting for the hunters who would eventually come for them. Danny decided to find them. It took months of searching. He traveled to the darkest corners of human space asking questions and following rumors. Most leads went nowhere, but slowly he began to find them. The marked. That was what they called themselves. Humans who carried the scars of hunts and lived to tell about it. Gray was the first one he found. She was a former Marine who had served on the front lines during the first incursion. Her entire squad had been killed when a trophy hunter attacked their base, survived by playing dead under the bodies of her friends for 3 days. The hunter eventually left thinking she was just another corpse. Taught Danny military tactics and strategic thinking. She showed him how to plan operations and how to think several moves ahead of the enemy. She was hard and cold and rarely smiled. But underneath that tough exterior, Danny could see the same burning determination that kept him going. Marsh was an engineer who had been marked on a research station. He escaped by rigging the station's reactor to overload. The resulting explosion destroyed the hunter's ship and gave enough time to flee in an escape pod. He had been running ever since. Taught Danny about technology and sabotage. He showed him how to build traps and disable enemy equipment. He could turn almost anything into a weapon with enough time and the right tools. His mind worked differently than anyone Danny had ever met. Where others saw junk, saw possibilities. Sophie Bell was a who had spent 30 years studying the. She had been captured during a research expedition and marked by a hunter as part of some twisted experiment. The hunter wanted to see how a human scientist would behave when hunted. Sophie escaped by using her knowledge of biology to poison her captor. Sophie taught Danny everything about physiology and psychology. She knew their weak points and their pressure points. She understood how they thought and why they behaved the way they did. Her knowledge was invaluable. Danny found 4 more survivors over the next year. Each one had their own skills and their own stories. Each one carried scars both visible and invisible from their encounters with the hunters. Together, the 7 of them formed a network. They shared information and resources. They watched each other's backs. They trained together and planned together. For the first time since Station Omega 7, Danny felt like he was not alone. But they were still being hunted. The trophy hunters did not give up. They did not forget, and they did not forgive. Eth killed 2 of the marked during years 6 and 7. The first was a man named Greg who had been hiding on a remote agricultural world. Eth tracked him there and killed him in his home. She left his body displayed in the town square as a message. The second was a woman named Carol who made the mistake of returning to human space to visit her family. Eth was waiting for her. The fight lasted less than a minute. Danny attended both funerals in secret. He stood in the shadows and watched the ceremonies and memorized the faces of the dead. He added their names to a list he kept in his pocket, a list of people he would avenge. But Danny did not just mourn, he struck back. During year 7, he tracked down one of Eth's resupply caches hidden on an asteroid in the outer belt. The cache contained weapons and medical supplies and tracking equipment. Danny destroyed it all. He rigged the asteroid with explosives and watched it turn into a cloud of debris from the safety of the drifter. During Year 8, he infiltrated the information network that they used to track human prey. He fed them false data, fake, misleading patterns. For months Eth chased shadows across the galaxy while Danny watched from a safe distance. During Year 9, he led her into an ambush on a frozen moon. He had spent weeks preparing the trap, explosive charges hidden under the ice, remote-controlled weapons positioned on the high ground. Everything was perfect. The ambush destroyed 2 of her hunting drones, expensive machines that took years to build and program. Eth herself barely escaped with her life. She retreated into deep space to recover and rebuild. It was a small victory, but it was a victory. For the first time, Danny had hurt her instead of the other way around. Word began to spread through the underground networks that connected humans on the frontier. There was a man who was fighting back against the Hunters, a man who had been marked for death but refused to die. Some called him crazy, some called him a hero, most called him a dead man walking. Danny did not care what they called him. He cared about results. The remaining marked gathered on a hidden station to discuss their next move. 5 of them sat around a table covered with maps and data screens. Sophie, Danny, and a young woman named Bate who had joined them recently. "She is getting frustrated," Sophie said. She was studying reports about Eth's recent movements. Her hunting patterns are becoming erratic. She is making mistakes she would not have made before. Nodded, good. Frustrated enemies make bad decisions. But frustrated enemies are also dangerous, pointed out. She might abandon her code, bring in reinforcements, change the rules of the hunt. Danny shook his head. She will not do that. Her honor means everything to her. If she calls for help, she admits that a human has beaten her. She would rather die than admit that. Bate looked at him. She was young, barely 20 years old. She had been marked only a year ago and still had the look of someone who was not quite sure how she had ended up here. "You really think you can beat her?" Bate asked. "A third circle trophy hunter who has never failed." Danny thought about the question. He thought about the 10 years he had spent running and training and fighting. He thought about the scars on his body and the names on his list. He thought about Eth pointing at him across that burning loading bay and calling him prey. "I do not know if I can beat her," Danny admitted. "But I know that I have to try, not just for myself, for everyone she has ever hunted, for everyone she will hunt if I fail." He looked around the table at the faces of his friends, his family, the only people in the galaxy who truly understood what he was going through. "We are not just fighting for our own survival anymore. We are fighting to prove that humans are not prey, that we can stand up to the hunters and make them bleed, that we are more than just trophies to be collected." Raised her glass to the marked. The others raised their glasses in response. "To the marked." Danny drank with them, but in his mind he was already thinking about the future, about the trap he would build, about the final confrontation that was coming. 10 years ago, Eth had given him 1 year to run. He had survived 10 times longer than she expected. Now it was time to show her why. Danny spent 4 years building the trap, 4 years of planning and preparation and sacrifice, 4 years of turning himself from hunted prey into something far more dangerous. The location was the most important part. He needed somewhere remote, somewhere that had no allies and no reinforcements, somewhere he could control every variable and eliminate every advantage she had. He found it on a dead moon called Harvest's End. Once it had been a thriving mining colony. Thousands of humans had lived there extracting precious metals from deep beneath the frozen surface. Then the mines ran dry and the corporations abandoned it. Now it was nothing but empty tunnels and rusting equipment stretching for hundreds of miles under a layer of permanent ice. Danny saw its potential immediately. The tunnels were a maze. Someone who knew them could disappear into the darkness and emerge anywhere. Someone who did not know them would get lost and die, and Danny intended to know every inch of them. He moved to Harvest's End in year 11. The remaining marked came with him. Sophie, Bate, 4 people who had become more than friends. They had become family. They spent the first year mapping the tunnels. They walked every corridor and climbed every shaft. They memorized every turn and every dead end, created a 3-dimensional model of the entire underground network. By the end of that year, they knew Harvest's End better than anyone had ever known it. The second year was spent preparing defenses, rigged explosives at strategic points throughout the tunnels, charges that could collapse ceilings or seal passages or turn entire sections into death traps, designed defensive positions where a single person could hold off dozens of attackers. Sophie identified the best places to store supplies and the safest routes for retreat. Danny oversaw everything. He worked 18 hours a day every day. He barely slept. He barely ate. He was driven by something beyond exhaustion, something that would not let him rest until every detail was perfect. The third year was spent stockpiling weapons and supplies. They smuggled in guns and ammunition from a dozen different sources. They stole medical equipment from abandoned stations. They gathered food and water and fuel, enough to last for months if necessary. Bate watched Danny during this time with growing concern. She saw how thin he was getting, how dark the circles under his eyes were becoming, how obsessed he had become with the trap and revenge. One night she found him alone in the main control room, staring at the tunnel maps. "You need to sleep," she said quietly. Danny shook his head without looking away from the screens. "I will sleep when this is over." "You will collapse before this is over if you keep going like this." Danny finally turned to look at her. His eyes were bloodshot and tired, but there was something burning in them, something fierce and unbreakable. "Do you know how many people she has killed?" Danny asked. "Not just humans, all the sentient beings across all the world she has hunted, hundreds, maybe thousands, and she did it for sport, for fun, for trophies to hang on her wall." Bate was quiet. "I think about them sometimes," Danny continued. "All those people who died afraid and alone, all those families who never got to say goodbye, all those lives that ended because one creature decided they were prey." He turned back to the maps. "I carry them with me, every single one. They deserve justice. They deserve someone who will make her pay for what she did." Bate put a hand on his shoulder. "You cannot save them. They are already gone." "I know, but I can make sure she never hunts anyone again. I can end her story and change the one that everyone tells about humans. We are not prey. We are not victims, and I am going to prove it." The fourth year was spent waiting and watching and preparing for the final move. Then Danny sent the message. He broadcast it on every frequency that Eth monitored. He made sure she would receive it no matter where she was in the galaxy. A simple message, a challenge, an invitation to end what she had started 15 years ago. 15 years is long enough. Come finish what you started. Come alone and I will face you alone. Bring others and they will die first. He gave her the coordinates to Harvest's End. He told her when to arrive. He made it easy for her because he wanted her to come. He needed her to come. The response came 3 days later, a single transmission from deep space. "I accept your challenge, Danny Cole. I will come alone as the code demands. Prepare yourself for the end of your hunt." Danny smiled when he received the message. It was not a nice smile. She was coming. After 15 years of running and fighting and bleeding, she was finally coming to finish it. But she did not know what was waiting for her. She did not know how much he had prepared. She thought she was walking into a final confrontation with her prey. She was walking into a killing ground. The days before her arrival were tense. Danny gathered the marked for one final meeting. They sat in the control room surrounded by screens showing every entrance to the tunnels. "You do not have to do this," Danny said. "Any of you. This is my fight, my hunt. You have already done more than I could ever ask." Shook her head. "We are not leaving." Nodded. We did not spend 4 years building this place just to walk away." Sophie smiled sadly. "Besides, where would we go? This is our home now, these tunnels, this frozen rock. This is where we belong." Bate was the last to speak. She looked at Danny with eyes that held no fear, only determination. "You gave me hope when I had none. You showed me that survival was possible, that fighting back was possible. I will not abandon you now." Danny felt something tighten in his chest. Pride, gratitude, love. These people had given him everything, their skills, their time, their lives, and they were willing to give even more. "Thank you," he said. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. The Marked spent the next few days making final preparations. They checked the explosives. They tested the communications systems. They reviewed their positions and their fallback routes. Everything had to be perfect. There was no room for mistakes. On the night before Eth was scheduled to arrive, Danny stood alone at the entrance to the tunnels. The frozen surface of Harvest's End stretched out before him, cold and empty and silent. Above him, the stars burned with ancient light. 15 years. It had been 15 years since he stood in that loading bay on Station Omega-7 and watched a monster point at him and call him prey. 15 years of pain and loss and transformation. 15 years of becoming something he never imagined he could be. Tomorrow it would all end, one way or another. Danny took one last look at the stars. Then he turned and walked into the tunnels. The hunt was about to begin. Eth arrived on the anniversary of her first hunt. Danny had planned it that way. He wanted her to remember. He wanted her to think about all the prey she had claimed over the centuries. He wanted her confident and proud and completely unprepared for what was waiting. Her ship touched down on the frozen surface of Harvest's End just as the pale sun was setting. Danny watched through the monitoring systems as she emerged alone. She was wearing her black armor and carrying her curved blade. The same armor and blade she had worn when she first marked him 15 years ago. She stood for a moment looking at the entrance to the tunnels. Then she smiled and walked inside. The hunt had begun. Danny had positioned the Marked throughout the tunnel system. Each one was at a choke point designed to slow her down. They were not there to kill her. They were there to weaken her, to strip away her advantages piece by piece until she reached the central chamber where Danny was waiting. Was the first to engage. She attacked from an elevated position using a long-range rifle. The shots were not meant to kill. They were meant to force Eth into cover, to make her use her energy shields, to drain her resources. Eth moved with incredible speed. She dodged most of the shots and deflected the rest with her blade, but she could not ignore entirely. She had to deal with the threat before moving forward. The fight lasted 10 minutes, fought brilliantly using every trick she had learned in her decades as a Marine. But Eth was a third circle trophy hunter. She had been fighting for longer than had been alive. Fell, but before she died, she triggered a collapse that sealed the tunnel behind Eth. There was only one way forward now, deeper into the maze. Was next. He had rigged an entire section of tunnels with traps, explosives hidden in the walls, automated weapons concealed in the ceiling, poison gas canisters buried in the floor. It was a masterpiece of destruction. Eth triggered 3 of the traps before she found. The explosives damaged her armor. The weapons destroyed her last hunting drone. The gas forced her to use her emergency air supply. Did not survive the encounter, but he made her pay for every step she took through his section. When she finally emerged, she was wounded and breathing hard. Her perfect armor was indented. Sophie waited in the deepest part of the tunnels. She did not try to fight Eth directly. Instead, she had prepared a biological trap, a toxin designed specifically for physiology. It would not kill her, but it would slow her reactions and cloud her thoughts. Eth walked into the trap without realizing it. The toxin entered her system through the damaged sections of her armor. By the time she killed Sophie, she was already feeling the effects. Her movements were slightly slower. Her aim was slightly off. Small differences. But in a fight between equals, small differences could mean everything. Bait was the last defender before the central chamber. She was young and inexperienced. She should not have been there, but she had insisted. She wanted to prove herself. Their fight was brutal and short. Bait managed to wound Eth twice before the Huntress ended her life, but those wounds added to all the others. The rifle shots, the explosives, the toxin, the accumulated damage of fighting through 4 determined defenders. By the time Eth reached the central chamber, she was not the same hunter who had walked into the tunnels. She was wounded and exhausted. Her armor was damaged. Her weapons were depleted. Her body was fighting the toxin in her blood. Danny was waiting for her. He stood in the center of the chamber surrounded by bodies. 9 hunters lay dead on the ground around him. Their black armor was torn and bloody. Their weapons were scattered across the floor. Eth stopped at the entrance and stared. Her 4 eyes moved from body to body, recognizing each one. "How?" she whispered. Her voice was hoarse. They were the elite of the 3rd circle. They were legends. Danny looked at her calmly. He was wounded too. Blood ran from cuts on his arms and face, but he was standing, and the hunters at his feet were not. "They followed you," Danny said. "They wanted to see the human who had evaded you for 15 years. They wanted to watch you finally claim your trophy." He smiled, and it was a cold and terrible thing. They should have stayed home. Ed's eyes narrowed. "You were supposed to come alone. That was the agreement." Danny laughed. "You expect me to follow rules after everything your kind has done, after all the people you have hunted and killed?" He shook his head. "The rules were always yours, not mine. I am just a human. We adapt. We improvise. We do whatever it takes to survive." Eth raised her blade. It was chipped and stained with blood, but still deadly. "You have killed my hunters. You have dishonored me. For this you will suffer before you die." Danny raised his own weapon, a blade forged from the metal of her first hunting drone, the one he had destroyed all those years ago. He had kept a piece of it. He had turned it into something new, something that would end her story. "Perfect timing," Danny said quietly. 9 lie here. Yours comes next." Eth snarled and charged. The fight lasted 7 minutes. 7 minutes of blades clashing and bodies colliding. 7 minutes of blood and pain and desperate survival. They cut each other a dozen times. They knocked each other down and got back up. They fought with everything they had left. Danny was slower than her, weaker than her, less experienced than her, but he had advantages she did not. He knew this chamber. He knew where every obstacle was and how to use them, and he had spent 15 years preparing for this single moment. Eth had spent 15 years hunting him, but she had been hunting the man he used to be, the scared cargo hauler who could not move when she pointed at him. That man was gone. He had died somewhere in the tunnels of Harvest's End along with his friends. The man who stood before her now was something else entirely. Danny blocked her final strike and drove his blade through her chest. The metal slid between her ribs and found her heart. She gasped, and her eyes went wide with shock. Her blade fell from her hands and clattered on the ground. Danny caught her as she fell. He lowered her gently to the floor and looked into her 4 amber eyes. "I was never prey," he said softly. "I was just a human who refused to die." Eth stared at him. Blood bubbled from her lips, but there was something in her eyes that surprised Danny. Not anger, not hatred, something else. "You have done what no other has done," she whispered. "You have beaten the hunter." A strange smile crossed her face. "Perhaps your kind is worthy after all." Then the light faded from her eyes, and she was gone. Danny stood slowly. He looked around the chamber at the bodies of the hunters and the friends who had died to bring him here. The silence was overwhelming. He activated his communicator and broadcast a message across every frequency in the system. A message that would reach every ship and every human colony and every corner of the galaxy. This is Danny Cole. 15 years ago your people marked me for death. Today I have killed the hunter who marked me and the 9 who came to watch. Let this be a message to all who would hunt humanity. We are not prey. We are not trophies. We are the species that learns. We adapt. We overcome. And if you come for us, we will teach you what it means to be hunted. He turned off the communicator and sat down among the bodies of his enemies and his friends. The hunt was over. But for humanity, a new chapter was just beginning. A chapter written in blood and sacrifice and the determination of one ordinary man who refused to accept his fate. Danny Cole had proven something that day, something that would echo across the stars for generations. Humans were not prey. They never would be again.